Hello and welcome to day 3 of Expo Walgoch. We've had a fantastic couple of days looking at the relevance of Welsh football to Welsh culture and society. We looked at the role of the women in the game as well as a bit of fun, looking at fanzines and how they've changed over the years. And we had a watch party for the game last night, pity about the result. But now we're looking to the future. We're looking for young sports reporters and how do you get into the business. All the best for this. I'm handing you over now to Steph. Thanks very much, Steph, for sharing this for us.
Thanks, Tim. We're going to be looking at the evolution of the football reporter. We've got a highly talented panel for you this afternoon, experts in their field. It's a unique opportunity for you guys to pick the brains about getting into the industry, getting ahead of the industry and succeeding as a football reporter. I'm Steph Guerrero, as Tim said. I'm a senior lecturer in sport media at Cardiff Metropolitan University. I'm going to be hosting things, trying to keep this lot in as much order as I can. And with the Champions League final just gone, the Euros just about to begin, football reporter is pretty much a 12-month-a-year job now. Our panelists have come to your screens via some different routes. I'll introduce them all to you and hopefully we'll get a little bit of a grip on how they made it and how they think that you guys might be able to make it as well. Ian Hunt is the lead sports presenter on BBC Radio Wales for the Saturday Sports Show and for Weekday Breakfast programme. Ian, welcome. How are you today? You okay?
I'm very well, thank you. Yeah, good to be here. Always a bit nervous to be on the other end of the questions, but yeah, I'm good, thank you.
Well, that's it. I'm wondering that about a lot of you today. This is going to be quite a different experience for you lot with me asking the questions and you guys having to come up with the answers. So when did you first think about being a football reporter? And when would that have come to you first?
I didn't really think about being a football reporter at all, to be honest. It was just something that I stumbled into by accident because I started out as a news journalist on the Western Mail's weekly newspapers. So I was down in sort of Neath, Port Talbot, Bridgend, covering those local beats. And from there I went to the Western Mail as a news journo. And it was only because the guy who a guy called Carl Woodward, who used to cover football on the Western Mail for years and years, was off sick, and they needed someone to step in and cover the Swansea City initially.
Right.
That I did it because I had a bit of background doing that sort of thing on student papers. So they asked me if I wanted to sort of help out for a few weeks. So I jumped at the chance to do that because I love football. But then he didn't come back. He had to retire, so I was offered the job permanently. So that's how it happened for me.
Wow.
I haven't stopped since then. So there was never a moment where I thought I really want to be a football journalist. But once I started doing it, there was no going back really to the sort of bread and butter news stuff that I was doing before.
That's cool. I like that. That's a very different route into things for Ian. Right. Abby Davis is a freelance sports broadcaster. You'll have seen her on Sky Sports, part of the FC Cymru team who brought you the Wales Euro squad announcement on Sunday as well. Afternoon, Abby. You okay?
Hello. Yeah, very well. Thanks.
You've covered an awful lot of matches in a short period of time. What would you say has been the highlight so far as a football reporter?
I think for me, as someone, my route into it was very different to Ian. So football, I think we can all agree, football's escapism for many people. And for me, that's how it started. I was a 15, 16-year-old girl in an inpatient eating disorder unit with a very bleak outlook on life. And my uncle took me to a football match. And from there, it just gave me, from being someone who thought I couldn't be successful at anything other than having a mental illness, I suddenly saw football as my route out. I saw it as 90 minutes where I could focus on a football match, focus on tactics and formations, and not being stuck in a unit with no prospects. So for me, that really gave me hope. And this career path, it gave me an outlet and gave me something to focus on that wasn't ultimately, not being around anymore. So for me, it's been maybe a longer process to get there. I'm 29 years old now, and I think that's something that's very important for people to remember, is that you see some people getting into this job at 21, 22 years old, and you think, why am I not there yet? But every route is very different. And yeah, like you said, I only started working for Sky Sports or covering football matches for Sky Sports in December. And I think the first game I did for them was probably my favourite, because I remember turning up. I've never been so nervous in all my life. I remember turning up at the ground, and I was so nervous that they said, "What's your name?" I muttered, and they said, "Oh, it's Amy." And I went, "Yeah." So they spent they spent over a minute looking for an Amy pass, because I was so nervous I couldn't correct them. So but turning up and thinking, do you know what? I'd really like, one goal just to ease me in gently. And I got a 4-3 with a red card. So, it's just like it. But that for me was the pinnacle. It just made me think, you've done it, everything that you've set out to do and everything that you've been through, the adversities, everything, you finally got there. So that game for me, it was at Crewe on a Tuesday night, but nothing will ever mean as much as that for me.
That's an amazing story. Thank you, Abby. Jordan Jones, our third guest, founder of a Club Peldroid website, covers all aspects of Welsh football. Jordan's also a student on our MSc Sport Broadcast course here at Cardiff Met. How are you, Jordan? You okay?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. And yourself?
I'm good, mate. Yeah, not bad at all. Your journey then into football reporting, how did that start as a thought process for you?
Well, in 2014, 15, I was kind of like disillusioned with the modern game, kind of with Cardiff City. And so I just looked at it, and I just wanted to give a bit more exposure to the Welsh domestic game. So the Welsh domestic game had been something that I'd kept an eye on, but didn't necessarily have a massive passion for it. And then it's grown since then. So it was a Twitter page, initially the website, where we just reshare what the clubs were doing, and then whatever stuff that was coming from the mainstream media. But really it was the clubs that were leading it. And then basically set up a website with Nick Davis, who's now working for the FAW. And then since then, we've regurgitated kind of what the clubs do. We also create original content now. So we offer like opinion pieces, we do our own interviews. And we're also doing live blogging and match reporting. So we've got a team of about 15 to 20 volunteers, and really like was just trying to cover the whole of the Welsh domestic game as well as the national team.
Okay. If you've got any questions for any of these three so far, then get them into the Q&A section on the Zoom call. Laura Kenyon is assistant editor of BBC Sport in Cardiff, also reports for Final Score, 5 Live and Match of the Day Wales. Laura, there'll be a lot of people on this who want to be football reporters. What's the most enjoyable part of the job so far?
Oh, that's a really hard question. Thank you, Steph. It's hard, isn't it? Because it's kind of everything's enjoyable when you're doing kind of what you love. And I think, I suppose from my background, I started off, and it wasn't just football that I was interested in. I was kind of interested in all sports, and it sounds a little bit tragic now, but when I was at university, I used to go around and I used to film all the other sports, and I did my own little sports blog, and this was many, many years ago.
Yeah.
And it was very cringy and very cheesy, but I loved doing it and I enjoyed it so much. And I think that's probably where it started for me. And I suppose after that, I obviously went off and I went and did news journalism, and I parked the kind of sports stuff for a while. So then when I went off and had my little boy and I came back and I thought, you know what, I really need a new challenge. And I came back and I said, if I'm going to do it now, I need to do it now. And yeah, I applied for an attachment in sport, and then I never left, and I'm still here. And I suppose the benefit that I've had doing what I do for BBC Sport here in Cardiff is that I've had some amazing opportunities on both sides of things. So the enjoyable part of going out to match days and going to games, reporting for Final Score on Cardiff and Swansea games, fantastic. Manchester United at the Principality Stadium was probably up there as probably my highlight, or as I say, I can't really pick between all of it. And then also, yeah, pitch sides, because TV is so different from radio as well. So pitch side for Match of the Day Wales on FA Cup games and Wales women's games as well. They're also different, but enjoyable and terrifying in different ways. But then I suppose, as I say, on the other side of things, I've and you'll know from your experience doing the job that I do now as an assistant editor is you get to kind of nurture new talent coming through, and you get to have those conversations with new reporters coming through and giving them opportunities to develop, and chucking them in the mix. And there's nothing more rewarding actually than giving someone a chance and seeing them really grab it and seize it. And excel. And we've got some wonderful fresh new talent coming through BBC Sport Wales at the moment, and it's been wonderful to see. And I think I suppose my one key bit of advice for people coming through has been like just grab every single opportunity, because there's so much in this industry to enjoy, and just make the most of everything, because yeah, I love every part of it on both sides of it, to be honest. So it's hard to give you a straight answer, Steph.
Right, Naz Premji is our fifth guest. Naz, a freelancer who's also worked on Final Score, Premier League Productions, and DAZN, to mention a few. Naz, what would you say the good and bad parts of freelance life?
Oof, the good parts of freelance life. Well, as Laura and the others have mentioned, covering football in any form, whether it's on the radio, whether it's on the TV, whether you're at a press conference, it's just an amazing experience. And the thing I will say is every single opportunity that I've had so far has been magnificent, and I feel so lucky and so honored to have been given those opportunities, because my journey into this industry was completely different. I was sat at university doing a financial services degree when, and we're talking 1994, so a good few years ago. I'm showing my age now as well. And basically there was a competition on my local radio station. In the old days when you had commercial and BBC stations both doing football, the commercial station ran a competition for a reporter of the year. And I just thought, you know what, I'll have a little go. I actually recorded David Ginola's goal for Spurs against Barnsley in the FA Cup. A few of you might remember that. It was an absolute screamer. And I recorded it on a cassette. Again, many people, I'm showing my age now. It was on a cassette. I actually did it the night before. The closing date for the competition was the following day. I actually hand delivered my tape to reception.
Yeah.
And then I got a phone call from a guy who works for UEFA and FIFA now, but he was the sports editor at the time, Steve Banyard. And he said it was actually my mum that took the message. And I was still at uni. I got back home. A guy called Steve Banyard's called. You need to call him back. I called him back. Naz, we like what we heard there. Can you come in for a little chat? And it kind of went from there. I actually didn't win the competition. I came third.
Who won?
Through that competition, believe it or not, I met my best friend, who became the best man at my wedding. And he went on to do a little bit of reporting. He's now a full-time architect. And I just got the buzz from there. And I was offered a role where I was going in every Saturday doing behind-the-scenes stuff in terms of producing, producing highlights, making sure interviews were going out and they were all edited fine. And I did that for about a year and a half. And I was still at uni at the time. A year and a half later, I graduated. And then the following sort of September, that particular station offered me a trainee news and sport journalist job. And my kind of career kicked off from there. But the first ever thing I did on the radio, believe it or not, was reading out the classifieds. And it is still the most amazing thing to do, because you have to do it in that way. You can't, there's nothing better than the classified results. Even though it was on a smaller station, you get the classifieds. That's really good. My first game, just to go back to Abby's point, was I was on a phone, believe it or not, a plug-in phone.
Yeah.
At the back of the stand at Saltergate, Chesterfield's old ground, Chesterfield against Luton. I had a glass sort of perspex screen to one side, so I couldn't really see who was taking the corner on one side of the ground. And right at the back of the stands, and it was Chesterfield against Luton. Luton won 2-1. Stuart Douglas scored 2 goals. And like Abby, that's probably the greatest day in my life, because that was the point I thought, actually, I can do this. And everything kind of kicked off from there. I went on to do a couple of different stations. And again, through various opportunities, managed to get on to 5 Live and Final Score. And I've been on Final Score for so long now. And every single season, it's a privilege. It really is. And I feel very blessed to have done it. So that's the good side. The bad side of being a freelance is, well, you're freelance. So you have no sick pay. You have no, you have no holiday pay. You have to make sure the work is there. And funnily enough, I had the day off today for this, but I got a phone call last minute to jump on and do some work at about 11 o'clock this morning. So I literally said, okay, I can only do till 1:30. And that was just doing some horse racing and greyhound racing and various other things. And I actually jumped on in the studio and I did 2 and a bit hours beforehand of work before jumping on to this session now.
The real world. I like
the real
this.
world.
Yeah. Lots of different ways in so far to the business. It's all educational and entertaining for the people watching so far. Bryn Law is our final panel member. Now, Bryn worked at Sky Sports for 20 years, the owner of a media and training consultancy business called Tag Media these days. You okay, Bryn?
Yes, very good. Thanks, Steph.
Excellent. Give us your route in then. Have you got anything similar to anybody else so far, or is this another route
Well, no, I'm quite surprised in a way, because what is interesting is the number of different stories that you're hearing, and that's instructive, and that's important that everybody is aware that there is no tried and tested route into this. At one time, maybe there was a perception that, like Ian's story, you did the news, you became a reporter first, so you worked on the newspapers, and Laura worked in news as I did. And then you sort of progress through from newspapers potentially to the broadcast media, and then you worked your way through that kind of world. That was going away back. Remember, I go away back because of all the panelists I'm seeing here. I don't want to say who's probably closest in age, but I suspect I might be out in front somewhere here. So, but my route in. The fundamental thing had happened when I decided at the age of 9 that I wanted to be a football commentator. I wasn't good enough at football. If I can't play it, I'm going to talk about it. That was my decision made then, nice, good and early. And I actually did make decisions from that point onwards, which were with a mind to ending up in that particular career. So when I went into school, English was a big subject for me because it's about language, and reporting is basically about communication and language. And once I'd decided that English was a subject that I really enjoyed, I also started doing drama because I felt that was a part of the whole program as well, because there is drama, and especially if you're doing stuff live. And then when I went to secondary school in North Wales, I started doing things like the talking newspaper for the blind that we used to put together every Friday morning. And then I got an opportunity, which was very important. Our local hospital radio station put a paper, an advert in the local newspaper, the Slutty Miler in Wrexham, to say that they wanted a new match commentary team. So I applied for that. I think I was 15 at the time I applied for that. And I went and talked to them, and they said, yeah, come along and do it. So I got the opportunity to start commentating on football, as I'd always wanted to do when I was sort of 15 years old. So I started doing Wrexham games for the hospital radio service. Brilliant training ground because nobody was listening. So it didn't really matter. You could make your mistakes without any sort of real repercussions potentially for it. But it wasn't half a great head start, so that when I'd finished my university degree, which was English and drama, those were the two elements again that I was marrying together. When I got out at the end of that, I'd applied for a broadcast journalism course, a 1-year course in Preston. And that was quite unusual because I think there were 3 media courses. Believe this or not, kids, there were 3 media courses available in the country pretty much at that time. There's one in London, there's one in Cardiff, there's one in Preston. I think Darlington did something as well. So you didn't have much option, not like now where you can go anywhere and do a 3-year degree. This was a 1-year postgrad. So I went and did a broadcast course. That was unusual because usually there'd been a plain journalism course, mainly aimed at putting people into newspapers. There were a thing called newspapers in those days, excitingly. And then after, so I did a broadcast thing because, again, focuses on getting to be a football commentator. So I did the course. Even before I'd finished the 1-year course, I'd gone on a work placement with my local commercial radio station in Wrexham. And they had sent me along to do a player interview with Mickey Thomas, famous name from Welsh football. And when I went to see Mickey, he was in the physio's room at Wrexham, and I was nervous. It was the first time they asked me to go and do anything like this. So I went to Mickey, who was eating a Cornish pasty, and he refused to stop eating the Cornish pasty as I was interviewing him. I didn't have the confidence to say, Mickey, you can't do this with you eating a Cornish pasty. I was a Wrexham fan, by the way, so I was in awe anyway. So he ate his Cornish pasty all the way through the match preview interview, and I had to take that back to the office and explain the circumstances. So that was my first kind of, wow, I've actually been out there and done a bit of that. They then sent me to report on a game before I'd finished the work placement. And that was the point at which that commentary stuff I'd done with hospital radio really helped. And then I went back there at the end of the course. In fact, even before the course had finished, they actually paid me to go and cover a game. So that was a kind of, I don't know, I can't remember off the top of my head which it was, but that was kind of the ka-ching moment, because that was the point at which I thought, actually, all that work I've put in may yet pay off. So I went away. I was trained as a news reporter on the broadcast course. There was no sports broadcast stuff you could do then. And so I came out of that to go into a news job, because now this was the traditional route. So I did the news thing for 6 months or so. And then I got a job at BBC Radio Leeds, and they wanted a news and sports reporter. This was a new concept, new breakfast show at BBC Radio Leeds, where they were merging news and sport. The two things weren't going to exist separately. It was an all-talk station. It was the first one in the UK as well, Radio Leeds. So they wanted somebody with sports knowledge who could go and work on the breakfast show as the reactive if there was any sports story there. So that was my role. And I did that for about a year, get up at 5 o'clock every morning, going in to do that. But they started giving me games to do as well, because they knew I'd done commentary previously. So I was doing games at night and getting home sometimes at midnight, and then getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning to go and do the sports bulletins, which I felt I had to do because I wanted to make this my job. So that was the commitment level required. And then there was a point after I'd done that for a little while where I kind of proved myself keen enough, I suspect. A gap opened up and I became the Leeds United commentator. And that was my door for 6 years into doing all the Leeds United matches home and away. And then I was in a plane crash with the Leeds United team, which one of the people from a new channel, a new thing called Sky Sports News was watching. Hadn't launched at that point, but they were planning the launch and they wanted regional reporters and correspondents. My name was mentioned. They got in touch. I went down to talk to them. A guy called Andy Kenyon, who was the guy who set up Sky Sports News, for a new service called Sky Digital, and they offered me the job with them. So after 6 or 7 years at Beeb, I went and took up that role with them, which I then did for 14 years. And whilst I was there, obviously, I did lots of other things, touchline reporting, Soccer Saturday stuff, match commentary on women's football, international football, Premier League, the whole sort of covered the whole lot, really. And that lasted until 2 years ago. And then I left Sky, and now I am, like Naz, terrified freelance. And here we are today, looking for every and any opportunity that may present itself to me. And that has also been very interesting, because that's taken me in completely different directions, still involved in sports broadcasting, pretty much, well, basically still involved in football. In one sense, I'm back where I started, because I'm commentating on Leeds United again for LU TV, which is another very important new aspect of the media that we have now, club-based media. There's an industry around that these days that you can look into and explore. But I'm also doing my own match production now, and we're covering games. We've covered all the Wrexham home games in the latter part of the season. We've done Connors Key in the Champions League, TNS in the Europa League, and we're looking to do that again this coming summer. So you've got to be adaptable, you've got to be flexible, and you've got to go out and look for it.
Absolutely. I think all of you seem to have had an opportunity and have taken it, whether you sort of knowingly or unwittingly. You've all gone for it to various different degrees of planning. Interesting, Bryn, that you mentioned there about the club side of things and being a very big part of the business. Now, if you just want to absorb things that are, take Leeds as the example, just published by Leeds, you could watch an Amazon Prime doc, you could listen to an official podcast, you could get on the YouTube channel, you could just follow their social media. You could only ever consume, not even just Leeds, but just Leeds stuff that's published by them now, which is a very different industry than the one certainly you, I, and Naz got into, and maybe Ian as well, got into at the start of our careers. How much, this is for all of you guys now, so feel free to jump in. How much can the fan in you still exist when you're doing this job? How much can you bleed it through? And has that changed over time, do you think? Who wants to take this one first?
Well, I can do over time, because I've been there over time, and I came into it because I was a fan. I was a Wrexham fan. I was a Wales fan. I used to travel abroad to watch Wales as a fan. And then I ended up being the touchline reporter on all the Wales games for 15 years. So I took one element, which was my passion and enthusiasm for this particular subject, which was the Welsh national football team. Yeah. Another element, which was they're going to pay me to go and watch Wales games. I'll have a bit of that. Yeah. And the third element was, but if I'm going to carry on doing this, I've got to be professional about it. And the culmination of that, the poster over my shoulder there, is the book that came out of the qualification campaign for the Euros. And culmination of all that was me on the pitch. That picture you can see on the front cover of the book there is me on the, well, I'm not on the pitch with the players, but the players on the pitch celebrating qualification. And I was on the pitch with them. And this was the greatest moment that any Welsh football fan had ever experienced. And I was one of those fans, but I was on the pitch with the players and I had a job to do. And that was to interview the players successfully for our live coverage, which we'd extended to incorporate this incredible event. So I had to keep it together down there, no matter what was happening inside. Externally, I had to keep it together to work my way through those interviews that I had to do to make sure the broadcast was a successful one. And somehow, just about managed to do it.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because apart from a very brief spell when I was about 17, when I commentated on Swindon Town for the local hospital radio station, when they were in the Premier League, and I probably won't ever, get to see that again. So I still feel quite privileged to have done that. Since then, I've never really worked on or commentated on my teams, the teams that I've supported growing up. So I've come to Wales as a student and, worked on Welsh football as a kind of outsider, if you like, albeit somebody who's then got wrapped up into the emotion of it all and, followed Wales, Cardiff, Swansea, Wrexham, and all of the club ups and downs. But I think the emotion of it, as Bryn is describing, is an important part, certainly of broadcasting. As a sports broadcaster, you're constantly conveying emotion. And Abby, I'm sure you'd agree with that. And Laura, you feel a responsibility to convey that emotion all the time, whether things are going well, whether things are going bad, the good times, the bad times. You're almost reflecting back the feelings of the listeners or the viewers, aren't you? So it's not a hard thing in a sense, because it's something you're constantly doing. Do you know what I mean? Every promotion, every relegation, every failure, you're finding the right words, getting the tone right, to convey what is going on. So you're swept along by that emotion, I think, to an extent. It must be hard to cover your club, I think, as Bryn's saying, as a big Wales fan, to actually go through all of that and to feel it in the pit of your stomach and to have to be neutral. But I think because there's so much emotion involved in it, that it's almost a natural thing, isn't it, to sort of ride along on that wave.
I think that's one of the most important lessons I learned when I started doing Soccer Saturday, and I got told, by a fellow reporter, you need to know these two teams like they are your own, because the fans watching and the fans listening to your specific bit will be fans of those two teams. And you know what it's like if you're a fan and you're watching and someone gets a fact about your team wrong when you're watching as a fan, and you think, how don't they know that? And that's what you need to keep in mind. And you need to almost take on and absorb. I listen to, fan podcasts the week before I cover a game. I'll listen to all of the fan podcasts to get a sense of what those fans are feeling at that moment. Speak to people. Don't be afraid when you turn up at the ground. Speak to their stewards, to their staff members. Find out how the fans have been feeling each week. Now that fans are returning and when it's safe to do so, go up to the fans, speak to them, see how they're feeling, because they are the important ones. Of course, you need to do, you need to know things about the game and the context that you give as a journalist, but it is that balance of being able to articulately sum up how those fans, what this means for the fans, and also what it means in football terms. So I think that's one of the most important things. I'll spend 2-3 days before a game making sure I know the positions of each player off by heart without having to look at a piece of paper. I'll have them written down, but I want to know how many goals each player in that team has scored before I turn up at that ground, because it should be second nature to me. This is what I'm getting paid to do. I'm getting paid to know this stuff. I don't want to just turn up and have to read things off a piece of paper. But I think that's something that is really important and something that I didn't learn until I was in that position.
There's a few questions coming in on the Q&A side of things. One's for you, Abby, because you're a pretty big Swansea City fan. If Swansea played Cardiff in a playoff to get in the Premier League, could you be impartial in that one?
It's really interesting that, and this goes back to your last question, being a Swansea fan, because I'll be honest, I'm still emotionally attached because I've watched them since a young child, but because I now don't get to watch games week in, week out, it's a different relationship I have with my club. because I'm not watching Swansea City week in, week out, and I'm watching other games, it is, it's still that love that I will always have. It, it's the most important relationship to me, but, it is a different, and I think you have to be that removed, that nobody would want me to turn up at a game, and even Swansea fans wouldn't want you to turn up at a game and be so biased that you're not reflecting that game. So I think you have to be able to remove yourself to a degree in order to do that.
I feel like that responsibility is probably even heavier now, isn't it? That actually fans haven't been in the grounds.
Yeah.
So actually, yeah, you feel even more responsible for painting a picture, for telling a balanced account of what has happened on the pitch, because they're not there to see it with their own eyes. So and Abby, what you said about kind of listening to fan podcasts, I think that was the most beneficial thing that I do in my kind of research when I'm prepping for games, is listening to those fan podcasts, because you just get some sort of a raw kind of description of exactly how they're feeling, and actually that does give you a sort of wider sense of where the club's at that particular point and that particular moment in time, that you don't get from the reporting that you might see on the mainstream media websites and the general reporting on linear TV and radio. So I think, yeah, that was really beneficial to my research.
I'll just come in terms of what Bryn was mentioning, in terms of covering your own team. There's different aspects to this as well, because there's two very different skills. Football, as Bryn will tell you, football commentary and football reporting, two very, very different skill sets, and you need to have different prep and different, maybe different kind of notes for each. And going back to the emotion, I have, obviously, and I don't hide the fact that I'm a Sheffield Wednesday fan. I have covered Sheffield Wednesday so much on 5 Live and Final Score. And even when they're getting absolutely battered, which has been quite a lot this season, I've had to keep it together, even though inside I'm actually cursing every away goal that's going in. I mean, my only enjoyment this year was the 5-0 against Cardiff. Sorry, Wales fans, but it literally was, that's the only time I've enjoyed where we actually turned up for the day. But it's so hard, and you have to be ultra professional, because with the onset of social media and everything else, it will just take one slip up for somebody to sort of jump on you and say, oh, he's a Wednesday fan, he's being biased, he's doing this. And you have to be so far removed from your own team. So your emotions have to be in check. I'll just go back a few years, actually a good few years. I was covering Chesterfield full match. We were doing, I was at a station that covered Chesterfield full match commentary. They were playing Sheffield Wednesday. It was a Sunday afternoon. We had a horrendous team, probably one worse than we've got now. Got absolutely battered. I remember Chris Brandon, I think it was, that scooted down one wing and put the ball in for Mark Hudson, who scored. And we were, Chesterfield were 3-1 up. And I was absolutely, very much like Bryn now on LUTV and Bryn back in BBC Leeds days. I remember listening to Bryn for many, many years, completely went for it. And, if anybody was listening to that, they'd be thinking I'm an actual Chesterfield fan. And I wasn't. I was hating every minute of that game inside. But you have to be so far removed from your own team, especially when you're covering them. And in terms of right now, with no fans in the ground, it's so hard. And you're always on edge, because you're thinking, I don't want to miss any vital detail that won't have been picked up by somebody who's listening. Obviously, the live streams have been going out and lots of fans will have been watching the game, but there's always things that are in the game that you don't see on the pictures. There's maybe the little kerfuffle in the manager's dugout where the subs are having a little bit of an argument or whatever, something like that can get missed because you don't see it on the live stream. So it's really, really important. But what I will say is there's two very different preps that you do, and Bryn will tell you more than this in terms of commentary and reporting, because they are two very, very different skills. And if you can do them both, you are in a very, very strong position.
I'd love to think that. Yeah, you're in a stronger position. That's for sure, because you are more useful in a sense to people. Perhaps it's not for everybody commentary, and as is absolutely right, there is a big gap between the two. And there are also a number of other gaps now, because although we're all discussing this, and all of us, I think, here pretty much have got that kind of the local, well, I won't, Radio Wales stroke. You've got localized coverage to the extent that you've got clubs that you're particularly interested in. Now that's become hyper-focused now, because as Naz has been saying, lots of people have been watching streamed coverage, which is like the old concept of the local radio coverage, but now with live TV pictures. Now, the tone for that, I'm doing LUTV games now. The Leeds United fans don't want a neutral commentary. They're paying their money to watch LUTV, or to listen to LUTV, because it's both. By the way, there's another challenge: audio and visual coverage, all in one go. So they are paying for Leeds United coverage. And I did a game for LUTV last season, which in that period at the end of the season in lockdown, it was actually exclusively live on the club media channel. This was the first time this had ever happened in UK broadcasting, that the clubs, or in this case, Leeds United, had their own exclusive rights to show the game, because Sky weren't showing the match. And it was the game at Swansea, which became the crucial game in terms of Leeds running to the end of the season. So I was commentating on that game, and the story is a great one. Pablo Hernandez goes back to his old football club and scores the winning goal for Leeds United in the 89th minute of the match, and I'm doing the commentary for LUTV. So you can imagine what that kind of requires in terms of the emotional input to the thing. So you do have to understand, as all the other guys have said, you do have to understand, what it is that you're dealing with here. Well, I knew full well what it was dealing with here. It was the goal that was probably going to send Leeds back to the Premier League after 16 years out of it. And it got the kind of treatment on that basis that I think as a goal commentary it deserved. And so I went mad, basically. And so my co-commentator was sitting alongside me, was Matt Jones, a former Wales and Leicester player. And Matt was just looking at me as literally as if I'd gone out, as I was on my feet and all the rest of it. But that clip of commentary has just been played again and again and again and again and again. If I had 5p for every time it'd been played, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you now. I'd be somewhere, I'd be somewhere hot on a beach or something. So you do have to understand, exactly like Abby said earlier. You have to work out what it is that you're going into and what your audience in effect for this is, and know. I would almost know what the editorial line with this is. What's the story today? What is the narrative here today? Every game has a narrative. And you need to understand that, as well as the stats and all the other things, the important statistics. And he's the leading goal scorer, or she's got made more tackles than anybody else. Those sorts of things that you can weave into the narrative, but you need to know the underlying. What's the story here today? Tell the story.
The non-match day side of things, the sort of reporting on a daily basis, going to news conferences, that kind of news agenda. Laura, that's very much part of your job at the BBC, is sending out the reporters. Well, what are you looking for in an up-and-coming football reporter? What kind of skill sets do they need for that side of things?
Good question. I think Hunty's very good at this, asking the difficult questions, not being afraid to ask the questions that that aren't necessarily going to get a nice, sweet, fluffy answer, and are actually going to be the ones that make kind of the news lines and the headlines. That's what people are interested in, and the ones that sort of people want to see if they're consuming their news on the website. I think also, though, I think we approach press conferences in a very different way now to even what we did kind of a few years ago. So whereas now we go into them and we are still hunting for those news lines, I think actually we go into them thinking, actually, what's going to do well on social media? What's going to sort of impact the younger audiences and the people that that wouldn't necessarily be interested by that? So we'll go into them thinking, actually, Neil Warnock was always a gem when he was at Cardiff. He just, anything he said was just gold. His anecdotes that just, you wouldn't even have to prompt him, and he'd start talking to Ian about how he was looking after ducks on his farm, and in his dressing gown, in his slippers with Sharon, his wife. And it, honestly, stuff like that, where you see a bit of their human side. So not being afraid to ask these questions of managers that actually we've all grown up watching them on TV, and kind of you see them in front of you as kind of these kind of amazing stars, but actually they're just humans, and we can ask them questions that we want to ask them, and not being afraid to do so. So I think, yeah, and also just also being able to write as well and turn these stories around. So being able to broadcast, fantastic. It's sort of the example that I might sort of make here is that I obviously, part of my job, I select who goes out to the Euros. So what reporters are we sending? So in that, I'm looking at, look, if there's a reporter that I can send who can do the presses, who can shoot video themselves, who can turn it around for social media, who can report on radio in both languages, and they've also got a good editorial head as well, and they can sort of do live updates, and they're CPS trained, and they can do live text updates into the website live pages. Then they've ticked so many boxes that I don't need to send 3 reporters to go and do that. I can send 1 person. So my advice on that would be accumulate and kind of gather as many skills as you possibly can, because then, yeah, fantastic. Not only can you get the news lines, but you can also do the other sort of content that surrounds that as well.
I think
the rest. Go on, Laura. Go on, Abby.
I was just going to say, following up on that, I think that is exactly obviously what I'd say. But I always used to get, I don't know if any of you got the same, if I'd apply for a job and it would say like, you need more experience. And I'd always think, how do I get that experience when, you know, no doors are open unless you have that experience? And the way I got it, which I would encourage absolutely everyone to, because as Bryn said earlier, you're allowed in this type of environment to make mistakes, is volunteer at your local football club. You know, I spent 2 seasons at Cardiff Met FC, and as it, you know, it gave me that opportunity to acquire that skill set that Laura just mentioned. I was able to self-shoot, edit it myself, but I'd be able to do interviews whenever I wanted with the manager and the players, and that allows you to experiment with how you ask those difficult questions, and, you know, kind of how much you can get away with, or, you know, what doesn't work. And it also teaches you what works best on different social media platforms, because you can play about with it. And I think that for me would be, you know, such a key piece of advice is, you know, there are so many local football clubs in Wales that would be crying out for help in the media department. And yes, it's a risk because, you know, you're not getting paid for it essentially. But I think a lot of the time that's how you have to start, you know, going from, it can be quite an ugly entrance into this industry, to be honest. You know, I went from that to being a runner at Sky to begin with. And that to me was one of the most valuable experiences ever, being a runner, because you get in at floor level, you get to speak to different people in that industry, but also I was working for nothing because I didn't get paid travel and I had to go from Swansea to London. So it was a massive gamble, but it forced me into, you know, having conversations with producers and trying to build up a reputation as someone who was knowledgeable or someone who deserved a chance. But I had to think about that myself and think of the ways in which I'd be able to stand out to them. So, you know, talking to them about games that maybe other people would come in and they haven't watched Cardiff Met against TNS on a Friday night. But, you know, and it's those little things that set you apart. So, yeah, as Laura said, acquiring those skills is so vital. And there are so many opportunities to do that within Welsh football.
Yeah, Jordan, your decision to set up your website and kind of come in at that sort of Cymru Premier, Welsh Women's Premier kind of level, was that all part of the process for you?
Yeah, definitely. It was a case of, I think, that the mainstream media weren't doing enough to cover Welsh domestic football. The coverage is always going to be on Cardiff City and Swansea City, and understandably because they have massive fan bases. They're known around the world and stuff like that. But ultimately, if you look into something like Northern Ireland and Scotland, it's their domestic leagues are heavily covered, not only by their national media, but also localized media as well. So for me, there needed to be something to be made. And I do feel that our website actually has prompted the mainstream media now to do more coverage. We've worked alongside of them and helped them with a bit more coverage. And they do ask us, and I do feel that when we're at games, we're on the same kind of footing as them. Is that obviously if a localized club gets told that one of the big media organisations in Wales is going down, it's much bigger for them than us speaking to them. But they do appreciate us coming down as one of them. That can be likened to when Abby was media officer at Cardiff Met, when she ran a Europa League media day. is that it was me that was asking the questions to Christian Edwards first, because I'd covered Cardiff Met for the last few years, and then ultimately the big organisations followed with their questions, but it was me that set that up, stuff like that as well. And just on the previous point with the fan kind of thing, from my perspective personally as a journalist, but also a lover of Welsh football, is that sometimes I feel that you can actually be a fan of the journalist's story in front of you. So, for example, one of these things was where Cam Bryan and Cleric Vale had been giant killers, had beaten like 4 teams in the League Cup, and then they were playing TNS, the biggest team in Welsh football. And I went down in the week and spoke to them, and you get to know them. And I wasn't necessarily wanting Cam Bryan to beat TNS, but I saw them beat TNS. And that's like one of the biggest moments in Welsh football in that season. And you kind of you're a part of that story because you're one of the people that's telling that story. And you can kind of feel happy for them. And it was the same with Cardiff Met, is that I'd covered Cardiff Met for a few years, and they had so much heartbreak in losing finals. And then eventually they got into Europe. And then I've seen Christian Edwards and their players over the last few years, that moment when they eventually qualified for Europe, you've kind of got to feel happy for them as well. And that's where the fan part comes in you. You're also telling the story as well. And everyone here has said that how they've managed to hold that expectation of being a journalist, but also being a part of the story as well.
This is interesting. So does it matter for any of you guys what level people would be reporting on? There'll be a lot of people who are in school, a lot of people who are in college on this Zoom at the moment. Covering a team at that level, are the skills then transferable up to covering Spurs, covering England at the Euros? Is it all transferable from the very base level for you guys?
I think so, absolutely, because when we all start at the sort of lowest level. I think, as I mentioned, my first game was Chesterfield against Luton, but for Final Score and for 5 Live, I've been to National League games, League 2, League 1, obviously Championship and Premier League. But the buzz and the joy for me is exactly the same. As long as I'm at a game, whether it is down the parks and I'm reporting on it, or whether it is at Molineux, I think was the final game of this season. I did Wolves against Manchester United. It is, those skills are very much transferable. I don't know what everybody else thinks, but I think if whatever level you start at, if you are reporting, commentating, and getting all the interviews and doing all the other bits and pieces that Abby and Laura mentioned, whatever level it is, those skills will transfer up. You're just talking to different people, maybe with a higher profile, and you're doing a higher profile game. But wherever you start, I think the level doesn't really matter. I think if you want to go into this industry, you need to be of the mindset, I don't care where they send me. They could send me to the lower leagues of Scotland. Yeah, as long as I'm at a football game, I'm absolutely fine, and I'm loving it on a Saturday afternoon. And that's what I would say is the key. You've got to you've got to be in this industry to love it, and you've got to go through the ups and downs. And Abby mentioned the volunteering. When I first started, I was going in off my own back on a Saturday, sometimes on a Tuesday, on a Wednesday. I was still at university. I was juggling a part-time job as well. I was in the checkout at Sainsbury's, and it was crazy. My life was completely consumed, but everything was geared towards me going in, doing my bit behind the scenes and learning off some of the best guys in terms of backroom team, and one of the best guys in terms of a commentator in Steve Banyard, and a few others after that, actually Paul Walker and Luke Wildman and a few others that went through that particular station. I learned so much from them, and I wouldn't have done that had I not had the determination to make it. And you've got to have that determination, and you've got to go through the hard times. As Abby mentioned, she was going from Swansea to London for next to nothing, but you have to do it. And if you are determined enough to do it, I think 99 times out of 100, you will succeed.
I agree with Naz. I think the broadcast skills are definitely transferable, but also the social skills are transferable as well. So what Jordan was saying about kind of he was first in line when Christian Edwards sort of was offering up interviews, and kind of the big media sort of bodies were there kind of knocking, saying, can I have an interview? He was first in line because he'd built up that relationship with him. And I think that goes a long way in this industry, is actually if you can build up relationships with people and kind of they trust you as a human as much as they do a journalist, I think that goes a long way too. So that sort of cuts through at every level. You can do that at any level whatsoever. So yeah.
And also, sorry, Bryn, what I would say is, you know, it's easier to do it at that level, at Cymru Prem level, than it is now at the higher level. It's very, very difficult to have those personal relationships with managers at Championship and Premier League level in the way that you used to. Because when I started covering Swansea on the Western Mail 20 years ago, which sounds painful, but it probably is about 20 years ago, you know, we're still in a position where you'd go on the summer tour with them, you'd go on the same flight as the players, you'd stay in the same hotel, you'd be on the bus with them to games, to the airport, everywhere. I remember even going to sort of bars and nightclubs in Holland with the chairman and the board of directors back in those days. So you'd be having a drink with them every night, talking to them, building those relationships, so you get to know them, they get to trust you, and you end up getting stories. Hopefully, that's the whole point of it as a journo, as well as obviously the manager. But these days, that's increasingly hard to do that, to get anywhere near anyone. Even if you have the manager's phone number, you can't just ring them up. You're obliged to go through the press office. So it's difficult to have those real personal relationships. So, you know, if you can start doing that at, say, as Jordan says, Cymru Premier level with Christian Edwards and so on, then you've got an opportunity to build up those sort of skills. In terms of when you actually get to press conferences, I think somebody made the point earlier, I think it was Laura, about trying to get content as well as trying to get answers to questions. So you're getting journalistic lines. I think, from my perspective, I think sometimes a lot of journalists, I think, are maybe a little scared to make a fool of themselves in press conferences, because they think, well, I've got to get this right. I've got to come across as credible, intelligent, and you know, people are maybe a little shy to make fun of themselves. But often, if you ask a slightly stupid question or a slightly off the wall question, you're going to get better content and better stuff, like the Neil Warnock story. You know, as well as asking the football stuff: who's injured, who's going to play, is it a big game, blah blah blah, all that kind of stuff. Ask them personal questions. So ask them where are they living, how are they getting on, where are their family, how are they dealing with the traveling, what's their favorite meal, you know, all that kind of daft stuff. But I think we're a little bit, sometimes we feel a little bit, I don't want to embarrass myself in a room full of journalists.
Yeah.
So I think there's two things. I think you have to do the serious journalism stuff, but I think sometimes at the other end of the spectrum, you have to be willing to make a bit of an arse of yourself sometimes to get the good stuff back.
Yeah.
Well, I would say on that basis. Well, go on.
Oh, sorry, Bryn. I was going to come in here in terms of making a fool of yourself. Very quick story. I was on a Premier League press conference with Sean Dyche, and at the end of it, I offered to cook him a curry, which he's taken me up on. So when restrictions are sorted, I've got to take a curry to Turf Moor, and that's the kind of silliness and nonsense that we were talking about, because one of the BBC Lancashire guys, his mother-in-law, had offered him some curry a few months ago, and I'd got on. I managed to speak to Dan Jewell about that, and he said, yeah, he loved it. I said, so at the end of the conference, I said, well, if his mother-in-law can sort you out, I want a bit of a curry off. And then we started talking about him doing Curry Wars on the BBC. But there you go.
That's good though.
Can I just say, I'll pick up on that. I think the trust element is absolutely crucial if you're going to build contacts. So they have to trust you, basically, and you have to give them the chance to trust you. So there may be stuff like Ian said there that occasionally you've seen or heard that you think about, what am I going to do with this information? Is it short-term gain for me, for long-term pain? Now, Laura might have a different view on this potentially, because I'm taking the material back to her in the office.
Yeah.
But I have had occasions where I've thought to myself, this is a good line, but this is going to cause me trouble with this person in future if I use it.
Yes.
And I'm going to make a decision that I'm going to be back here next week and the week after that, the week after that, the week after that. So I'm not going to use it. And I will hope that Laura doesn't find out and I get into trouble as a result of it. So there is a trade-off, because you've got people behind you in the office telling you, ask this. And then you're the person, not them, sitting in the room with Sir Alex Ferguson in front of you in a packed media conference, having to ask him about his next game against Norwich when it's a Champions League press conference, because that's what Sky Sports News want to talk about, because they didn't have Champions League rights at the time. So you can find yourself a pawn in the middle here. So you make some decisions on the basis of what's going to work well for you with this person or this group of people going forward. And the other thing I'd say on the trust basis is it's just a game. Football is just a daft game. We all enjoy it. We all love it. We're all passionate about it. We're all enthusiastic about it, all the rest of it. But when all's said and done, there are far more important things in life. And I have tried to keep that sense of perspective all the way through 30 years of the career, because I think that actually helps you dealing with people in front of you as human beings, and not sort of saying, you know, then you don't. Sometimes I've had to interview friends of mine who've been managers, and I've had to ask them the difficult question about, do you think this is your last game? So I have to ask it in the right way that they don't feel I'm attacking them all of a sudden, but you're my mate. But they know I've got to ask the question. And you do find yourself in those positions, but it's not life and death. It's a game. Keep the sense of perspective about it, and keep the sense of enjoyment about it when all's said and done as well.
Right. Bryn makes a really good point there, because it is so easy for you in a post-match press conference or a pre-match press conference. I'm going to give you two very quick examples. I was on the final press conference ahead of the Manchester United game for Nuno Espirito Santo. He'd done the press conference at 12:30. And Bryn will tell you these things go in some kind of order. So Sky have their little bit at the beginning, and generally whoever's on Sky, Ian Bolton or whoever, will have asked all of your questions that you want to ask. So you've got to think on your feet and think, well, okay, what am I going to ask Nuno now? So that's one thing. I then went on and did my questions, and within 10 minutes of that press conference ending, Wolves made the statement that he'd gone, and there was no inkling at all in that none of us, absolutely none. And I was at the game on the Sunday, and I asked all the local guys, BBC WM guy, he said, Naz, we had absolutely no idea. He was talking about a summer rebuild and summer transfer plans, and within 10 minutes of that press conference finishing, he'd gone. So, and then I'm getting calls from the Premier League saying, did you know? No, of course not. If I'd known, I would have asked the question, as would anybody at Sky and everywhere else. In terms of the managers under pressure, Dougie Friedman was under pressure at Bolton. I was doing post-match. They just got completely, I think they'd lost 4-0 to, funnily enough, Crystal Palace. It was a Bolton 0, Palace 4. He was obviously the Bolton manager. There's 10,000 Bolton fans screaming for his head. Literally, we want Friedman out. Myself, I was doing the BBC interviews, and Neil Mellor, Abby's Sky colleague, and Bryn will have worked with Neil for many a time. He was down doing the post-match for Sky. And Neil, and we had a chat before Dougie arrived. He said, Naz, do you mind going first? Because I don't want to ask him the question that needs to be asked. I said, okay, I'll go first. And if you want, you can just, use whatever line that so I asked him, and we talked about the game. And at the end, I said, Dougie, everyone's calling for your head. There's fans protesting. What's your message to them, ahead of what could be a very difficult few days for you? And he answered it really well. He said, I understand the frustrations, etc., etc. And it's the way you phrase that question. If I'd have gone in and said, you're going to get sacked next week, Dougie, aren't you? That's not going to work. You're not going to get the answer that you want. But I framed it in a sort of nice way. He was fine. As soon as the camera was off, I said, Dougie, I apologize. I had to ask you because they call it. He said, of course you have to ask me. They're calling for my head outside. There's 5,000 of them that want to lynch me. I'm going to go out the back door. And then Neil Mellor did his interview for Sky. And funnily enough, he asked exactly the same questions, framed a little bit differently. And at the end, Dougie, what about your future? Obviously, there's a lot of pressure on you. And he did exactly the same. He framed it in such a way that was friendly. We all had a little chuckle afterwards. And I think within 3 days, Doogie had gone. But you have to make sure that you are, as Bryn mentioned, you know, you're the one in the firing line. You're there week in, week out. You're going to be speaking to these people on a very regular basis. You don't want to be making enemies of them, because they will not speak to you and they'll not give you the good content that you need further down the line.
This has been fascinating. Thank you guys for this past hour. I wish I'd had something like this 20 years ago when I was kind of trying to start out in the business. There's some really useful tips there. And as you'd expect from 6 broadcasters, a lot of good stories as well. So thank you very much for your time on behalf of everyone who's on the call. Tim, back to you, mate.
Absolutely superb session. I've been monitoring the Twitter and getting some texts. People who don't actually want to get into sports reporting have been enjoying it. The anecdotes have been so good. My takeaways, though, and it's far too late for me, as you all know, was Bryn's comments: be adaptable, be flexible, you've got to go out and look for it. And then Laura saying, gather as many skills as you can. And of course, as we're hearing there, you've got to make relationships. This business is about making and maintaining relationships. On behalf of the Expo, Steph and the panel, thank you very much. It's been absolutely superb. Diolch yn fawr iawn i chi.